Okay, we're back. Just trying to sort out some technical difficulties here. It's not really my thing that I do, but I'm willing to kind of work through those technical difficulties because the fact of the matter is, we've got some serious problems in this country. That horrific shooting that happened in Pittsburgh at the synagogue, where 11 people were killed. It was meant to send a chilling message. And that message is this: it's simple, that if you're one of the others, and what do I mean when I say an other? If you're other than white Anglo-Saxon, if you're black, if you're Hispanic, if you're Jewish, and even if you're Catholic, don't relax. Don't think that you are out of the danger zone at any moment at your house, at your place of worship. You could become a victim to violent racism. I want to talk about how we got to this point. Do you know that this is nothing new in America? Unfortunately, when we have been taught in history, whether in public schools or private schools or colleges or universities, the presentation of American history has been smoothed over, for lack of a better term. The down and the dirty, the deep and the dark, the ugliness of what actually happened to various groups as they came to this country, in the case of my ancestors, unwillingly, but others, the Irish, who are largely Catholic, the Jews, the Hispanics who are still trying to immigrate, trying to flee dangers that they are aware of in their homelands, gangs and drugs and all of the things that an average and reasonable person would want to flee in terms of seeking safety for his family or her family. The things that we know we want for our family. We want to make sure that under no circumstances certain people enjoy those same freedoms and those same rights and those same privileges that we enjoy. But let's talk about the fact that this is nothing new in history. I mean, at some point, the Asians, the Chinese dealt with this. We passed national legislation to limit and to demonize Chinese people. Certainly, we know that African Americans, we were slaves, and then at the end of slavery, we were segregated. There were black codes, there was Jim Crow, and that lasted for another 100 years. But what we've been taught, which is just factually incorrect, which will inform our ability to understand what's happening today, is that the push to equality and inclusion in this country has not been one linear journey. It has been rather a cycle. So, in other words, there's been times when this country was very much about bringing everyone into this big tent that we call America, this tapestry, this melting pot. But then there have been times when this country has been very inward-looking, very self-centered and self-focused, and all of its policies and all of its actions, both in this country and abroad, were aimed at protecting America. Now, there's nothing wrong with America trying to protect America, but America trying to protect America should not and does not automatically equate to demonizing other people, exploiting other people, and certainly not injuring other people, killing other people simply because of their faith or the color of their skin. But we have this spate of these things happening. And I'll tell you something. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that those of you who are my Facebook friends will come back real soon and tell me, Jerry Girley, Attorney Girley, Pastor Girley, you are wrong. You missed it. You misdiagnosed the problem. I will gladly apologize. I will gladly come on and say I made a mistake. But I don't think so. I think what we're going to see in the near future is copycat actions like this. And I was on last week and I was talking about the fact that we have to elevate our level of awareness and our level of concern in our homes. We have to do what we have to do to be safe. We have to do what we have to do in our houses of worship. That's sad. That's tragic. I know for me, the house of prayer, God's house, is the ultimate place of mental and emotional and spiritual refuge for me. And to just think that at any moment when I'm in that sacred space, trying to make a connection to God, trying to recharge my batteries, just because of the color of my skin, someone can burst through those doors and begin to commit acts of racial violence and carnage just because I am who I am, what I am, that which God has created me to be, a man who is black and who's comfortably black, unapologetically black. But for that, I'm a target. My mother's a target. My brother's a target. My sister's a target. My aunt and my uncle in their places of worship. This is nothing new. In this country, many people who identify as fundamental Christians in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, those same people burning crosses. How dare they take such a sacred image as the cross of Calvary, the cross of Jesus Christ, which represents and stands for something very monumental. Take that cross and burn it in the yards of black people to intimidate them. Blow up churches, bomb churches, burn down houses of worship in the name of God. What is the problem? How can we connect those dots? How can those two things be consistent or equal or related to each other? How can we say that we value life so much so that we want to bomb churches and that we want to blow up houses of worship? We want to shoot innocent people on their day of worship. But I can tell you this, and I have been very respectful, and I will continue to be respectful of the office of the presidency of the United States. But I can tell you this, that the current occupant of that office is not respecting the office himself. More importantly, contrary to what he says, he can deny it. He can say that it's not him, but it is him. Now, he didn't create racial division and he didn't create racial hatred in this country. It existed long before him, and certainly it will exist to the extent that America exists. It will exist long after him. But the reality is that he has done his level best to drive a wedge between Americans, to create hate and distrust, such that Americans hate each other more than they hate and distrust the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans. How is that we can look at our fellow Americans with disdain and with disregard for the sanctity and the value of their lives just because they're in an opposite political party, or they don't share all of our views, just because they want to see certain people have an opportunity to immigrate to this country? Whatever the issue is, there's hate that's being spewed every day on the radio, on websites, and from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Yes. And we need to get away from this false equivalency where we're saying that this person who was a Bernie Sanders supporter shot Congressman Steve McLeese. Well, that is true, but Bernie Sanders never invited or suggested to anyone that they commit acts of violence. And even if Bernie Sanders did, in which he did not do, but even if he did, we cannot say that a congressman inciting violence is the same thing as the president of the United States using reckless language that invites or implies or suggests that American citizens turn their weapons or turn their rage or their anger or their distrust against each other. I'm telling you this, that there's some challenging days ahead of us. This thing is not going to go away by itself. It's not a storm that's going to blow over. It's going to get worse because everyone is in denial. Everyone is receding to their respective political corners, and everyone is trying to get a political angle and think of how they can spend this for this last week of the midterm elections. But this is so much more profound and impactful, and the results will be lasting far beyond the midterm election or even the 2020 presidential election. We are reaching an intersection. We are reaching a critical point. We are reaching a point of no return. One of the problems, or one of the complications of us not putting enough emphasis on studying history to its fullest extent, is that we are ignorant of history. And what happens when we are ignorant of history is that we are filled with this sense of arrogance, this sense that America is impervious, that the things that is happening in Brazil, the things that are happening in Iraq and Iran and in Germany and France and wherever else there may be instability in the world, that those things, because we are Americans, that those things can't happen to us. But those things can happen to us. Let us not forget that 150 plus years ago, we had a civil war. And I want to talk about that. Yeah, it was over slavery. It was to some extent, but slavery wasn't the only thing that drove that civil war. Fundamentally, what we had over 150 years ago that led to the American Civil War is that we had two separate and competing but diametrically opposed visions of what it meant to be Americans and what it was going to take to make this country, for lack of a better term, great. There are some who thought that America should build itself and become powerful on the backs of as many groups that it could possibly exploit. And of course, that included African slaves, that included Native Americans, that included the Irish when they first arrived here, that included the Italians. That vision of exploiting whoever for however long you can, that's not a new approach. Demonizing and dehumanizing certain ethnic groups such that you feel comfortable treating them less than human, that approach is as old as America. And that stream, that virulent stream of wayward political thinking has always been present in America, but there's been another stream that has contended with it through time, that has said that the way that America becomes great is by including all people and bringing all people to the table and letting all voices be heard, and that it is absolutely unnecessary to demonize anyone, to exploit anyone. Those broad concepts have always been at tension as long as America has been a country. And in the 1860s, it culminated in a civil war. And then the wave of contention died down, but it never, ever completely went away. So at times, this virulent strain that says the way that we do this is we demonize, we exploit, and if necessary, we kill the others. It subsided. It lied strategically dormant in the American soil, in the American psychic, but it has never been eradicated. And so all it needed was the right, but really the wrong politician, the wrong political party, the wrong political climate to come along, and there it is. It's like a keg of dynamite just waiting for a match. And now this is how you should interpret what's happening in our world, in our country today. The two competing ideas about what is necessary to make this a great nation. And that's the truth. I mean, you could put it in political terms. You can put it in ideological terms. You can put it in partisan terms. You can say it's the Democrats versus the Republicans. You can say it's the liberals versus the conservatives, the libertarians. But there are two competing visions. And as long as those competing visions aggressively and assertively and systematically assert themselves, we are headed toward another civil war. You say, well, that can't happen. Oh, it can happen. I hope that I'm wrong. I've said this enough times. I'm not wishing for it, but at this point, I'm expecting it. It's dangerous what's going on. These are dangerous times. We have got to tone down the rhetoric, and when I say we, I mean the political leaders. And I mean the we starts with the President of the United States and certainly every elected official. But you know what? We cannot tone down this rhetoric. We cannot rise to the occasion and do what we have to do if we are in denial. We are in denial about a lot of things. Hatred still has a home in this country. Bigotry still has a home in this country. Racism still has a home in this country. And for us, now I'm speaking about African Americans, you know, our misconception has been that we need to get enough statutes or laws passed that ensure our freedom. And once we got to a certain point in terms of statutes and laws and ordinances, and we know, all of those things are important. As a lawyer, I'm all for it. But please understand that the law is only as good as those who seek to implement it. The law is only what the judge that you're in front of, if you're in court, says it is, or the jury who may or may not be willing to apply the law to your set of facts the way that it should be applied. Here's what I'm saying to minority groups, and that's blacks, Hispanics, Catholics, Jews, whoever. Your rights are not what's written in a book. Your rights and my rights and all other minority groups' rights are the rights that the present white majority are willing to recognize. Period. End of the story. And so I say that not to make you resentful, not to make you anxious, but to stress that it's important for us to remain sober and vigilant at all times. You know, I've often used a medical metaphor in discussing this. There are certain physical conditions that we know there's no cure to. And I think that racism is like, high cholesterol or high blood pressure or diabetes politically. We don't have a cure for that. And if it is allowed to run amok, it will kill you. However, there are drugs that enable us to maintain and to manage that condition such that it is not causing harm to us beyond what it has to. And I think politically, we've got to get into that mindset, we being those who come under the ambit of considered to be others, blacks, Hispanics, Jews, Catholics, anyone who's identifiably not white, Anglo-Saxon. You've got to realize that the primary and the permanent treatment of political racism, bigotry, and prejudice is sobriety. We must remain sober at all times. We have a security problem right now. I mean, if you're going to church and you're listening to this and you're going to go to church tomorrow, make sure they have a security plan. And I mean, lock the door, have someone standing at the back door, seeing who's entering and who's exiting. I mean that sincerely. I don't mean that metaphorically or symbolically. I mean that literally. Do that. Be safe. These are trying and testing times. But here's the thing. I don't want to just leave it at that dark place. I also believe, as a man of faith, that God is sovereign and that God governs and reigns in the affairs of man. And that on any given day, it may seem like the circumstances are completely out of control, but God has it He has it under His control. And He's taken us to a destiny that at this point we can't even imagine. But the end of the matter will be something good and something great for those who trust Him, for those who look to Him. This is not the time for us to be turning our backs on God. This is not the time for us to claim a level of intelligence and enlightenment to the point that we reject religion, as some in society suggest that religion and faith is only for the feeble-minded. No, sir. Absolutely not. This is the time to press into your faith. This is the time to trust God like you've never trusted Him before. Those of you that are listening, those of you that are prayer warriors, this is the time to pray. This is the time to call on the name of God, because He answers prayer. I think if I can shift from my lawyer, political hat more into the realm of the spiritual and put on the Pastor Girley hat, I would tell you that what's happening around us is spiritual warfare. You know, the Apostle Paul said that we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual wickedness in high places. There is something happening, church folk like to say, in the atmosphere. There's hostility. There's transition. There's strongholds that are being dealt with, strongholds that are being cast down. However you want to characterize it, something is happening, and it's not business as usual. I don't think that we're going to be the same after this series of events that we've just gone through. After this election, after this presidency, I think something substantial is happening in the atmosphere, in that unseen realm. I think God is effecting a change in this country. In this country, in our day and time, we're living in a historic time. It's important for those of you who are people of faith to not neglect to pray. And as the Apostle Paul said, men ought to always pray. It is times like this that remind us that if we can do nothing else, and I suggest to you that there's a lot that we can do, and we'll talk about that later. As I close, though, as I bring this little conversation to a close, I want to remind you that prayer, my mother used to say this, and in fact, she still says it, very much alive. Prayer changes things. I believe that. I've built my whole life on that notion, on that concept that prayer really does change things. We need to pray for our country. We need to pray for our leaders, and we need to pray for those who are disadvantaged, those who are being targeted for no other reason but by their innate quality, the color of their skin, the place from which, the nation from which they come, the nation where they were born, whether they are Mexicans or Guatemalans or Haitians or Jamaicans, whether they are born in the Middle East, whether their faith is Christianity, whether they're Muslims, whether they're Christians. We are all Americans. And either we're going to work together to figure this out, or we're going to all go down together. I see us metaphorically in a bus together, driving somewhere. And can I tell you, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I see the current leader driving the bus, and he has on blindfolds, and we're yelling, "Hey, you're going toward the edge of the cliff. You're going too fast, and put your foot on the brake," and he's putting his foot on the gas. And we're shouting at him, but he has on earmuffs. Something's got to change. If it doesn't, You figure out what's going to happen. We need to pray for our leaders. We need to pray for the president. We need to pray for Congress, that Congress would stop being so partisan and so cowardly, doing or not doing what they're supposed to do. The way that this system of government is structured, as far as I understand it, is that we're supposed to be having checks and balances. Congress is supposed to put a check on the executive branch of government. Congress is not doing that. Congress is looking out for Congress. Who's looking out for America? The whole of America. Not just the Democrats, not just the Republicans, but who's looking out for all of us? We need to pray. And we need to be concerned about each other. Here's my last thought. I know I said that a moment ago, but really this is my last thought. I had a friend who is an African-American gentleman. I met him over 25 years ago, almost 30. When I met him, he was just coming out of a black nationalist organization in which they took an extreme position against white people. Essentially, what they taught was all white people are evil, and that our response as black people should be to be prepared to go to battle with them. And he was involved in that organization, and he had moved up very high in the ranks, but he came to our little storefront church, and he was in a phase in his life where he was trying to reorder and rethink everything. And so we struck up a friendship, and I asked him, I said, what made you decide to leave that organization? He said, I grew up as a Christian going to the Baptist church, and I learned about Jesus, and I learned about salvation and all of those things. But what alerted me to the fact that I might be in the wrong place was that every time that I left that place of worship, I was always so angry. I always wanted to walk up to the first white person and sock them in the face. And I just knew that when you leave a place of worship, you should not leave so angry. Why am I telling you this? If you want to know whether you're on the right track or whether you're on the wrong track, I think that brother's insight into what he was involved with is very much appropriate. It's very much predictive and accurate and diagnostic in terms of appropriate and accurate diagnostic in terms of what's happened today. Why are so many people angry? Jesus asked his disciples when they wanted to call fire down from heaven and destroy the Samaritans who didn't receive him. He said, you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy these people? Jesus looked at them with shock and he said, what manner of spirit do you have? And I asked my fellow Americans, those that can go into a synagogue and shoot down 11 innocent people, who can go into a Kroger supermarket and shoot a black man in the back of his head in the presence of his grandchild, who can send bombs to 2 former presidents, 2 sitting congressmen, just because of the color of their skin. I ask you, my fellow American, what manner of spirit do you have? Who have you been listening to? Who has misled you? Who has fed you this garbage that would make you have such hate in your heart for your fellow human being? What manner of spirit do you have? Okay, I'm done. We'll talk later.